To most people in the medical field, the feeling of helping those suffering is a reward in itself. But for Donald Harvey, it was the perfect opportunity to have ultimate control and power over a person's life. His story would ultimately unravel secrets that remained in the dark for almost 2 decades. Why would a nurse murder his helpless patients? Was he trying to put them out of their misery? Or was there something much more sinister afoot? Welcome back to M7 Crime Story Time, where we tell mysterious tales of true crime cases from across the globe. And today, we're looking at the story of the Angel of Death, Donald Harvey. But before that, if you haven't subscribed to our channel already, please consider doing so. Hit the like button and click on the notification bell to get the latest content. Let's dive right into the story without any further ado. Born on April 15, 1952, in Hamilton, Ohio, Donald Harvey was the oldest of 3 children. The boy with his big brown eyes and curly hair was lovingly called Donnie by his parents, Ray and Goldie Harvey. Shortly after his birth, the family moved to Boonville, Kentucky, a small community nestled away on the eastern slopes of the Appalachian Mountains. There, Ray worked as a tobacco farmer while Goldie tended to the children and home. While the couple was struggling with extreme poverty, their marriage began to fall apart. Despite a rocky relationship, they were loving and nurturing to their 3 children. Although Donald was a quiet boy who mostly kept to himself, he apparently had shown no signs of any abnormality. Perhaps the seed of his sadistic and twisted mind was sown long ago in his past. According to some reports, Donald was sexually abused and assaulted by at least 3 different men between the ages of 4 and 21. One of them was his own uncle on his mother's side, who molested him during visits to his grandmother's home. Another one of those sexual predators was an older neighbor who offered Donald money for sexual favors. At the age of 18, Donald claimed that he was sexually assaulted by his then roommate Randy White. Though a traumatic past is no excuse for heinous crimes, it might be a point of discussion for psychologists and criminal profilers. In school, Donald always seemed to be a loner and antisocial. He rarely participated in extracurricular activities, opting instead to read books. While this got him good grades, it also earned him a reputation for being the teacher's pet, which led to teasing. Following his graduation from Stigan Elementary School, Donald entered Boonville High School in 1968. Despite his good scores, he rapidly became bored with the daily routine, which prompted him to drop out. He later received a diploma from a correspondence school out of Chicago and got his GED the following year at the age of 16. Having no future aspirations, Donald didn't know what he would do with his life at this point. He eventually relocated to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he managed to secure a job at a local factory. Donald was doing well in his job until the work dried up at the plant in 1970, and he was eventually laid off. A few days later, his mother called him and asked him to travel to Kentucky and visit his ailing grandfather, who was recently placed in Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. He had no idea that agreeing to his mother's request would forever change the course of his life. While visiting his ill grandfather every day, Donald formed a trusting bond with the hospital workers. In fact, they liked him so much that he was offered a job at the hospital. It was here that a terrifying journey of madness and mayhem began, which would go on to last nearly 20 years. Donald's true motive for wanting to work as a nurse's aide might not even be known. However, some people believe that he was desperate to earn money after losing his previous job. He was not a trained nurse or doctor, but the hospital staff had full faith in him. Donald's duties required him to spend hours alone with patients, including changing bedpans, inserting catheters, and passing out medications. While looking after the patients was by no means an easy job, Donald's first few weeks at the hospital were uneventful. That is until one incident with an elderly patient snapped something within him, a disturbing beginning to an unfathomable string of events. It was May 31st, 1970, and Donald was taking care of an 88-year-old stroke victim, Logan Evans. During an evening shift, he walked into a private room to check on the elderly patient, and Mr. Evans rubbed feces in Donald's face. Although the patient was most likely not in his right mind following a stroke, the incident angered Donald so much that he lost all control. The next thing he knew, he was smothering the elderly man with a blue plastic bag and a pillow. Once Evans was motionless, Donald listened to his heart rate with a stethoscope to make sure that he was dead. He then disposed of the plastic bag and cleaned him up, dressing them in a clean hospital gown and showering before notifying the nurses. After this incident, no eyebrows were raised and no questions were asked. As a predator who just got his first taste of blood, Donald's thirst for killing only grew. The very next day, he was looking after another elderly patient, 69-year-old James Tyree. Donald, it seems, used the wrong size catheter on him. Tyree initially let him proceed, but then yelled at him to take it out. Donald used the heel of his hand to control him until he vomited blood and died due to an air embolism. Again, no suspicions were raised. As no one detected foul play in his first two murders, Donald became more carefree. Just 3 weeks after committing his first murder, he cut off the oxygen tank of 42-year-old patient Elizabeth Wyatt. This was the beginning of his mercy kill, as he would call his killings later. He claimed he was aware that she was praying to die and even told him she wished she could die. So he killed her to end her suffering. 4 hours later, a nurse found her dead. Again, no one questioned Donald. Since no one at the hospital became suspicious, Donald saw this as an opportunity to unleash his inner monster. Over the next 10 months, 15 patients died under his care while working at the hospital. Be it pleasure or experimentation, the methods of each murder varied. Smothering, sabotaging oxygen tanks, injecting lethal drugs, overdosing people with medication. It seems he would use almost anything to kill. When angered, his methods became more brutal. On one occasion, after an argument with a patient, Donald snuck into the patient's room and inserted a coat hanger through his catheter, puncturing his bladder and bowel. As a result of the puncture, infection set in, and the man died a few days later. Despite this brutality, Donald always considered these killings to be merciful. The self-proclaimed angel of death wanted to play God with the lives of the vulnerable, cloaking his monstrosities in a warm blanket by giving them the title Mercy Killings. March 31, 1971. Exactly 1 year after his first murder was the last day Donald worked at Marymount Hospital. That evening, he was arrested for a burglary he committed while drunk. In his drunken stupor, Donald incoherently confessed about the murders to the cops. But no one took him seriously. Donald ultimately faced charges of petty theft. Instead of serving prison time, he paid a hefty fine. Although Donald managed to remain free, this incident changed the course of his life for a brief time. For the next few months, Donald tried to get his life back in order and eventually found work as a part-time nurse's aide at Cardinal Hill Hospital in Lexington. In June of 1973, he started a second nursing job at Lexington's Good Samaritan Hospital. He worked both jobs simultaneously until deciding to move on to other positions. Between August 1974 and September 1975, he worked first as a telephone operator in Lexington and then as a clerk at St. Luke's Hospital in Fort Thomas, Kentucky. For some reason, Donald was able to control his urge to kill during this time. It's possible that he simply did not have the same access to the patients as he did at his previous workplace, which could also explain why he shifted from job to job during this time. Despite his efforts to keep his killing urges in check, his inner demon slowly became increasingly more difficult to manage, finally driving him across the state line into Cincinnati, Ohio. In September 1975, Donald moved back to Cincinnati. And within weeks, he started working the night shift at the Cincinnati VA Medical Hospital. He worked there as a nursing assistant, housekeeping aide, cardiac catheterization technician, and autopsy assistant. As he became more comfortable in a hospital setting once again, he started right where he had left off. Since he worked at night, he had very little supervision and unlimited access to all the areas of the hospital. Over the course of the following 10 years, Donald would end up murdering at least 15 patients while working at the hospital. To relish all his crimes, he even kept a detailed diary of his murders and took notes on each victim. These grisly details included sprinkling rat poison in a patient's dessert, pressing a plastic bag and wet towel over the mouth and nose, injecting cyanide into an intravenous tube, adding arsenic and cyanide to orange juice, injecting cyanide into a patient's buttocks, and many more. Yet the depravity of his crimes did not end there. Throughout his murder spree, Donald was experimenting with different methods based on medical journals he was studying for hints as to how to better conceal his crimes. Cyanide soon became his favorite tool for murder. He'd mix it into the victim's food or pour it directly into their gastric tube. Over the years, he amassed an astounding 30 pounds of cyanide which he slowly pilfered from the hospital. He would keep his deadly supply at home for safekeeping. Despite all the deaths, Donald Harvey always managed to stay under anyone's radar. He had carefully set up all of his killings to look like accidents or natural causes. Donald even earned himself the nickname, the Angel of Death, and the Kiss of Death amongst his coworkers. They all thought it was a coincidence that he was always around when these deaths occurred. Little did they suspect that their charming coworker was a silent predator. So years down the line, Donald insisted that his crimes were merely an act of mercy motivated by compassion. There were other crimes that speak otherwise. The beginning of the 1980s brought out variations in both Donald's life and his crimes. Without a doubt, these crimes were purely driven by rage and revenge. In the early 1980s, Donald briefly began dating a man named Doug Hill. The relationship was challenging from the start as they argued on a regular basis. After one of those heated fights, Donald retaliated by slipping arsenic into Doug's ice cream. Although he survived, the incident signified the first instance where Donald tried to harm someone outside of the hospital. This was a chilling sign that the monster had begun to stretch his boundaries. Following another fallout with Doug, Donald moved in with another lover, Carl Heller, within a short period of time. The relationship was going well in the beginning before Donald suspected Heller of cheating on him. Out of jealousy, he would add small doses of arsenic into Heller's food so that he would be too ill to leave their apartment. At this point, Donald's acts of revenge were no longer limited to home or the workplace. On one occasion, following an argument, he laced one of the beverages of his female neighbor with hepatitis serum, which nearly killed her before the infection was diagnosed and treated. While luck was on her side, it wouldn't be the same for another of Donald's neighbors, Helen Metzger. The arsenic he put in one of her pies caused her death at a local hospital a week later. Donald's confidence was soaring high after getting away with so many murders. He must have felt invincible. In April 1983, after a tiff with Howler's parents, Donald regularly began to poison their food with arsenic in small doses. On May 1, 1983, Joella's father, Henry, suffered a stroke and was admitted to Providence Hospital. To complete his unfinished business, Donald placed arsenic in his pudding before leaving during a hospital visit. Sadly, the elderly man died later that night. Donald continued to poison Carl's mother, Margaret, off and on for the next year, but was unsuccessful in his attempts to kill her. In January 1984, Howler broke up with Donald and asked him to move out. Needless to say, Donald was not happy about it. Unable to accept the rejection, he spent the next 2 years trying to kill his former partner with his poisonous concoctions. As a means of revenge, Donald even went at great lengths in an unsuccessful murder attempt against one of Howler's female friends. Though he managed to land Howler in the hospital at one point, his attempts to eliminate him from the face of the earth had failed. The first cloud of suspicion that loomed over Donald's head was on July 18, 1985, when security guards noticed Donald acting suspiciously and decided to search his gym bag. Inside the haversack, the guards discovered a .38 caliber pistol, hypodermic needles, surgical scissors, gloves, a cocaine spoon, various medical texts, 2 occult books, and a biography of serial killer Charles Sabridge. Fined $50 for carrying a firearm on federal property, Donald was then given the option to quietly resign from his job rather than be fired. Call it a stroke of luck or pure negligence from law enforcement's side. None of these ever appeared in his work record. And the hospital authorities did not open an investigation to determine if the man was responsible for any other crimes while working at the hospital. It took Donald 7 months to secure another job at a local hospital. In February of 1986, he started working as a part-time nurse's aide at Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati. Unaware of his past and impressed by his performance, his new employers soon offered him a full-time position at the hospital. Before long, Donald settled back into his old routine. Over the next 13 months, Harvey murdered another 26 patients and attempted to kill several more by disconnecting life support machines, injecting air into veins, causing suffocation, and injecting arsenic, cyanide, and petroleum-based cleaners. The 2-decade-long murder spree came to an end with one last murder. On March 7, 1987, a 44-year-old patient, John Powell, mysteriously died. Powell was on life support from a bad motorcycle accident for several months before his demise, but had since started to recover. Due to Ohio's law of a mandatory autopsy for vehicular homicide, this death landed Donald in a situation that he had never faced before. During the autopsy, an assistant coroner noticed the faint scent of almonds, which is a telltale sign of cyanide. Authorities got involved in the death following this concerning discovery. Initially, suspicion fell upon the people closer to Powell, but investigators failed to come up with any evidence or motive pointing toward any of Powell's friends or family members. So it did not take them long to focus on hospital employees who had access to Powell's room. Donald Harvey was one of those names on the shortlist. To rule out their names, hospital employees at this point were volunteering to take polygraph tests. Donald also volunteered to take a test and even bought a book on how to beat lie detector tests. But eventually, he did not go through with the test and called in sick on the day of his scheduled appointment. If this was not concerning enough, investigators learned about his questionable partner from the VA hospital as well as his notorious hospital nickname, the Angel of Death. Given the numerous unusual deaths that seemed to surround him, authorities began to focus their entire investigation on Donald. He was brought in for questioning. In the initial interrogation phase, Donald denied having anything to do with Powell's murder and portrayed himself as a victim of coincidence. It was only after hours of questioning and playing a bit of good cop, bad cop that he finally confessed to having put cyanide in John Powell's G-tube. He tried to explain that it was because he felt sorry for him and his family. He still denied responsibility for any of the other suspicious deaths. Donald was taken into custody while investigators began to look for other evidence. On August 11, 1987, Donald Harvey, 35 at the time, sat down with investigators and confessed to committing 33 murders over the previous 17 years. The number grew to 70 in total as the days passed. Investigators wanted Donald to undergo a mental state evaluation before his claims were taken to be accurate, as they were doubtful of the numbers Donald provided them. Following several psychiatric tests by numerous experts, it was determined that Donald knew the difference between right and wrong and was able to conform to the conduct of the law. Hence, he was sane and competent. In November of 1987, Donald Harvey was sentenced to 8 life terms plus 20 years for the murders at Marymount Hospital. In February 1988, he entered guilty pleas on 3 additional Cincinnati homicides and 3 attempted murders, drawing 3 life sentences plus 3 terms of 7 to 25 years. The investigation into the remaining deaths was closed after 2 years, as investigators determined that there was not enough evidence to implicate him in the murders. Whether people were stunned or disgusted by his actions, they definitely weren't intrigued to know what went on inside his sick mind. In a 1991 interview, a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch asked Donald Harvey about his motive behind the killings, giving away a rare glimpse inside his mind. Donald said that the reign of terror began with a desire for control. In his eyes, people controlled him for 18 years, and then he controlled his destiny. He loved the power and the ability to control whether people lived or died. Even in the world of serial killers, Donald Harvey holds a special place, not only because of his overwhelming kill count, but also because of his choice to kill people he personally knew in addition to his patients. According to an article published on July 23, 2001, by the Associated Press listing the worst serial killers in the United States, Donald Harvey held the number 1 place, even surpassing the notorious John Wayne Gacy. While everyone expected Donald Harvey to spend his days behind bars and, unlike his unfortunate victims, die a natural death, destiny had something else in store for him. On March 28, 2017, 64-year-old Donald Harvey was found badly beaten inside his cell in protective custody at the Toledo Correctional Institution in Lucas County. He would die 2 days later at the age of 64 from blunt head trauma due to skull fracture and brain damage. Once after the death, an inmate named James D. Elliott, serving 37 years for numerous burglary offenses, would later write the Toledo Blade and confess to the murder. In those letters, Elliott confessed to punching and stomping on Donald in his cell. He said he grew up in Kentucky near some relatives of Donald's victims and claimed that he committed the crime to give them some closure and peace of mind. Hopefully, everyone from our area will take some solace in the fact that one of their own gave Harvey the punishment that he should have gotten from the courts. Elliott was quoted as writing, In September 2019, Elliot was sentenced to life in prison after pleading guilty to the murder of the infamous Angel of Death. To his last day, Donald Harvey insisted that the majority of his killings were out of mercy. But the truth is, in the process of becoming a murderer from a nurse, Donald appointed himself the judge, jury, and executioner over people's lives. Perhaps because he was not caught for decades, he assumed it was his right to control other people's lives. Do you think that Donald revealed the true count of his victims? Or do you think his words should not be trusted? 11-year-old Sally Horner was a smart, cheerful, and quiet girl. She was at a local 5 and dime store in 1948 and decided to steal a book on a dare. When she did this, however, she was stopped by a man who claimed to be an FBI agent and who said he was going to arrest her. What unfolded after this between her and the stranger was an extremely disturbing tale that extended for the next few years of her life. This is the story of a young life cut short, a young life full of potential that was taken away too soon. This is the disturbing case of Florence Sally Horner. Welcome back to M7 Crime Story Time, where we cover solved, unsolved, and twisted cases from across the globe. Today, we're looking at the case of Florence Sally Horner, a case from the 1940s that will leave you shocked and disturbed. So without further ado, let's get started. The young, beautiful little girl you see here is Florence Sally Horner. She was born in Trenton, New Jersey, on April 16, 1937, to her father Russell Horner and mother Ella Goff Horner. Sally also had a half-sister named Susan Swain, who was 11 years older than her. When Sally was still quite young, her father died, leaving her mother to take care of the family and be the sole breadwinner for the two girls. Ella Horner, Sally Horner, and Susan Swain continued to live together at 944 Linden Street in New Jersey. Sally attended an elementary school called Northeast Elementary School that was in the area. The year was 1948, and Sally was soon going to turn 11 years old. By this time, she had grown into a beautiful, bright, and cheerful little girl. At school, she was known to be very punctual and a good student. At the time, most girls her age wanted to join the girls' club that their school had, and this was something that Sally too yearned for. However, the girls who had formed the club told her that if she wanted to join, she needed to steal something from the local 5 and dime store as an initiation task. The thought of doing something like this made Sally hesitant, and she wondered if it was worth the risk. But later, she decided to go ahead with it since she had always dreamed of becoming one of the girls. Sally's birthday was fast approaching, and she'd finally turn 11 years old. However, little did she know that her life was soon going to take a turn for the worse, a turn that was so disturbing and dark that nobody could have seen it coming. During the early summertime in 1948, shortly after Sally's 11th birthday, Ella Horner decided to go on a cross-country trip. Ella took her daughter Sally along to accompany her on this journey. On their travels, they decided to stop at Atlantic City. During their time there, Sally managed to find her way into a local 5 and dime store on her own without her mother's company. When she entered the store, she remembered the dare that the girls at the club had given her and realized that this was likely her best opportunity to steal something. Sally then decided to go ahead and steal a notebook. As she picked up a 5-cent notebook and shoved it into her bag, a middle-aged man grabbed her by the arm and told her that he was an FBI agent. He told Sally that she was under arrest for stealing from the store. No real FBI agent would harass a young child in a store in this manner. So who was he really? The man's name was Frank LaSalle. He was not with the FBI or any other law enforcement agency. He wasn't even a security guard who worked at the store. So who was he? By the time Sally met Frank LaSalle, he was a 50-year-old convicted child abuser. Frank had been released on parole that very year just 2 months before he met Sally at the store. He had served time for the statutory physical abuse of 5 girls. These girls were between the ages of 12 and 14. Sally was also close to this age group when she met Frank, but of course, Sally didn't know this. When Sally heard the words, "You're under arrest," it terrified her. This was the first time she'd ever been in any sort of trouble, considering that she'd always been an obedient girl at school and a loving daughter to her mother. As a young child, she didn't know better and thought she was really about to be arrested. The man then told her that he'd let her go as long as she reported back to him from time to time. If she didn't, he told her he'd place her into a reform school. Now when Sally heard this, she felt that she had to agree to his rules. She felt like she couldn't tell her mother because she didn't want her to know about the crime she'd committed. Also, as a young child, it seemed to her that reporting from time to time was a much better option than telling her single mother she was going to prison. For the next 2 months after the incident in Atlantic City, Sally would report to Frank from time to time, who'd followed her and her mother back to New Jersey under the pretext of keeping an eye on her. As she was doing this, Frank was collecting information on her and slowly planning his next moves. Frank left for a while, but then stopped by to see Sally again in the middle of June of 1948. This time, while she was walking home from Northeast School. At this time, Sally had just finished the 5th grade. When he met her, he had new instructions. These instructions demanded something that sounded terribly difficult to her. Frank wanted Sally to go back with him to Atlantic City, the same place where they'd met. This meant that she'd have to leave her family and go somewhere alone with this total stranger. Frank had a plan ready. He intended to pose as the father of Sally's classmate and invite her for a week-long vacation to Jersey Shore. Sally was hesitant to tell her mother about this at first, but she was more scared of the threat of going to jail. So she worked up her courage to do so. She went ahead and informed her mother that she'd been invited on a week-long vacation to Jersey Shore with a friend's family. Ella Horner, Sally's mother, thought that this was a wonderful opportunity for her daughter. She felt like her daughter was finally making some good friends, so when Sally asked her for permission, she agreed to let her go. On the day Sally was set to leave, she walked her a few blocks from their house at 944 Linden Street to the Camden bus depot. There she noticed Sally interacting with a man who she thought was the father of Sally's friend. She said goodbye to Sally and told her to have a good time and then return home safely. However, little did she know that the man Sally was with wasn't someone she should have trusted. Frank had already planned what he was going to do by the time Sally's whereabouts became a concern. This plan also got Sally off the radar while making it look like there was absolutely nothing wrong. On arriving in Atlantic City, Sally and her abductor Frank both posed as father and daughter. They had their names changed and started living a completely different life. Sally was given a new name, Florence Planet, while Frank LaSalle also became Frank Planet. They didn't stay in Atlantic City for long, and soon after the two moved to Baltimore. Frank made every effort to make it appear as if Sally and him were a family. He sent her to St. Dan's Catholic school near where they lived. While doing this, Frank never forgot to make Sally write letters to her mother. He supervised what she wrote to make sure that she never revealed anything about where they were or what was going on to her mother. After the first week, Ella was waiting for her daughter to come back from vacation. But instead, a letter arrived from Sally. In the first letter, Sally said that she'd enjoyed her week-long vacation and wanted to stay a little longer. From then on, 1 week stretched into 2, then 3, then 4. Finally, on July 31st, 1948, Ella received the last letter from Sally. In it, Sally told her mom, "I don't want to write anymore." On receiving this message, Ella immediately called the police, knowing that something must have gone wrong with her. By August 5th, 1948, the search had begun. At this time, both Frank and Sally had moved to Baltimore. Frank had sensed that the place would arrive in Atlantic City soon enough and decided to get out of there. Meanwhile, the Camden detectives who were investigating Sally's kidnapping arrived at 203 Pacific Avenue in Atlantic City, the return address on the first few of Sally's letters. However, it was too late by then because both Sally and her abductor were long gone. As the case was progressing, new charges were now brought up against Frank, which made it impossible for them to stay in Baltimore. This made Frank decide to move to Dallas. Young Sally never thought she'd find herself in such a situation. The man who had kidnapped her kept telling her that he was an FBI agent on his secret assignment. During the days, she'd be sent to school and posed as the loving daughter of a single father. And by night, she was abused and tortured. The routine went on for weeks, which soon turned to months. In Dallas, Frank found himself a job as a mechanic. Through this, he was able to get some money, and it helped keep up the appearance that he and Sally were just a regular father and daughter. They stayed at a quiet, well-kept trailer park called the Dallas West Mobile Home Park on West Commerce. Here, Frank continued to send Sally to school. He enrolled her at Our Lady of Good Counsel, a Catholic school that was on South Marcellus at 9th Street. During this time, he tried his best to pose as a father to Sally in the eyes of the public. Some of the neighbors found Frank to be very aloof and standoffish, while the girl Sally was very pleasant and a typical 11-year-old living with her widowed father. She had a generous allowance for clothes and sweets. She'd go shopping, swimming, and to her neighbors' trailers for dinner. Everyone thought her father was providing for her quite well. Back in New Jersey, it had been 5 months since Sally was kidnapped. Her mother, Ella Horner, had not yet given up hope in searching for her daughter. Meanwhile, in December of 1948, back in Dallas, where Sally was living with her abductor, the routine remained. She'd be physically tortured and abused day after day. However, during the day, she'd often be seen doing what a typical 11-year-old would do. It was at this time that Ruth Janice and her family moved into the trailer next door to the Planets. As time went by, Janice began to grow suspicious of the relationship between her neighbor and his daughter. She noticed certain things that made her have doubts that they were actually father and daughter. The fact that Frank never let Sally out of his sight, except when she was at school. The fact that she never had any friends her own age. That she never went anywhere and just stayed with her father in the trailer. All these things made her wonder if Sally was in trouble. Sally, on the other hand, was continuously tortured until her body felt sore. One day her condition got so bad that she had to have an appendectomy. Her surgery was done at what's now called the Scottish Rite Hospital for Children. After the surgery, she walked like a stiff old lady. Instead of getting better, she was getting even worse. Slowly, the neighbors noticed that Sally was not herself whenever her father Frank was home. Janice planned on getting some information. When she got her alone, she tried to ask Sally what was really going on between her and Frank, but Sally wouldn't say anything. Finally, Janice decided not to meddle with them. She had also decided to move to San Jose, California in search of work. By February 1950, Ruth Janice and her family had packed up and moved to San Jose, California. A few months went by, and Janice finally settled down there. She was still worrying about Sally and wanted to be sure the girl was all right. So she sent a letter to Frank LaSalle in Dallas encouraging them to come west where there'd be more opportunity. In February 1950, this is what Frank and Sally did. Sally's health was getting worse in the meantime. It got so bad that eventually she admitted the truth to a classmate about the true nature of the relationship with the man claiming to be her father. The friend told her that the behavior was wrong and that she ought to stop. But it was too late. Before her friend could help her, Frank had taken her to San Jose, California. On arriving in San Jose in February of 1950, Frank and Sally met Janice again, and they began to settle themselves in their new surroundings. However, by now, Sally felt like she had enough of this life. The next month on March 21, 1950, she gathered all her courage and managed to get Janice to a private place, and finally she opened up to her. She told her that she'd been kidnapped and wanted to go home. Sally had nothing else on her mind but wanting to be with her mother and her sister back in New Jersey. Janice immediately assisted Sally in calling her family in Camden after receiving this information. By this time, Ella believed that her daughter had been lost. So when she got the call on March 21, 1950, Ella was overjoyed that her daughter was alive and wanted to come home. As soon as she got the news, the Camden County detectives and police force set off to bring Sally back home. The FBI recovered her from a trailer park in Southern California and arrested Frank. On March 31, 1950, Sally boarded a plane with a Camden County prosecutor en route to Philadelphia International Airport, where she'd be reunited with her mother, Ella, and her older sister, Susan. By this time, her older sister, Susan, had given birth to a baby girl during the time Sally was in captivity. Frank was arrested on March 22, 1950, in San Jose, California. Even when he was caught, Frank continued to claim that he was Sally's father. However, authorities in New Jersey had already confirmed that Horner's real father had passed away years ago. After evidence was found, Frank was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 30 to 35 years in prison under the Mann Act. Sally had finally been reunited with her loved ones. During the summertime, she went out with her family to Florence Township. She even tried to live like a normal child, but things didn't fall back into place as she thought they would. It took longer for her to find herself once again, and no one could blame her because she was just an 11-year-old girl when she was kidnapped and held captive for 21 months. There were signs that she was struggling to readjust to normal life. For instance, she hardly made any close contact with the people around her. She also suffered psychological trauma because of her experience, but her family and the community continued to give her support. Though this was helpful on their part, Sally continued to struggle with her emotions. When Frank's sentencing was announced, Sally finally felt a sense of peace. She felt like she'd finally received justice. However, she continued to be indifferent to her surroundings. The memories of her abduction and abuse still ran fresh in her mind. But despite the terror and the isolation she'd experienced, she did find small moments of joy and hope. There were times when she remembered making friends with people she met along the way. One of her most cherished memories was attending school again. These little moments of joy made Sally a truly remarkable and brave girl because she managed to find the light in the darkness. However, just as inspiring as her efforts were, Sally had another tragedy befall her soon after. It had been 2 years since Sally returned home to Camden to live with her family. On August 18, 1952, she was on a trip to the shore near Woodby, New Jersey. While returning home from her trip, her car crashed into a parked truck. She died in an instant. She was just 15 years old. As the Associated Press reported on August 20, 1952, Florence Sally Horner, a 15-year-old Camden, New Jersey girl, who spent 21 months as the captive of a middle-aged moral offender a few years ago, was killed in a highway accident when the car in which she was riding plowed into the rear of a parked truck. Not many people who knew Sally are alive today. Her niece Diana Shamingo, now 70, who was born in August 1948, 2 months into Sally's captivity, is one of the few still around. Kai Mingo, who lives in Burlington, was 4 when Sally died and lived much of her life unaware that there was such a person as Sally whom she was related to. But even if the people who knew her personally are now few and far between, we hope that through this video, more will know the story of this brave girl and appreciate the courage and strength she displayed. What did you think about this brutal yet inspiring story of Florence Sally Horner? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. On March 6, 1959, 9-year-old Candace "Candy" Rogers was out selling Girl Scout cookies in her Spokane, Washington neighborhood. It was quite normal at that time for young children to go out unaccompanied by an adult. However, when darkness began to fall and she still hadn't returned, they started to panic and reported her missing. Soon, everyone in the area was out searching for Candy. What could have happened to Candy? Why had she not returned home before nightfall like she always did? Could something terrible have befallen her? Welcome back to M7 Crime Story Time, where we cover solved, unsolved, and twisted cases from across the globe. Today, we'll be looking at one of the oldest cold cases to ever be solved. A case that took over 60 years to finally be unraveled. Let's dive right into this mystery without any further ado. Our case today takes us to Spokane, also known as the Lilac City, the largest city in the state of Washington. It's located in eastern Washington, near the Spokane River and Silk Mountains. Covering an area of just under 70 square miles, it has a population of over 220,000 people. It's well known for its vibrant culture with many museums and theaters, and for hosting Spokane Hoop Fest, the world's largest basketball tournament. And Spokane is where our tale begins. On July 13, 1949, in the city of Spokane, Carl and Elaine Rogers were blessed with a beautiful baby girl who they named Candace. They were overjoyed at the birth of their first child. Candace was a bright and beautiful baby. She had a happy, carefree childhood and grew up without a care in the world. She was well loved by her family and friends who affectionately called her Candy. She was a friendly child, outgoing and always willing to make new friends. She attended the Holmes Elementary School in Spokane, where she was beloved by her peers and teachers. When she was 9 years old and in the 4th grade, she began to take part in after-school activities. She joined the Camp Fire Girls, a Girl Scout organization. As part of her responsibilities, she was tasked with selling campfire mints to the public to raise money for their trips. She did this regularly, and even at the young age of 9, her parents often let her go from door to door alone to sell mints. Sadly, they would come to regret this decision. March 6, 1959, was a normal, uneventful Friday in Spokane. Candy went to school like she did every day and then returned home. After she left to go sell campfire mints in the neighborhood where she lived, it was common for Candy to go sell mints unsupervised. The neighborhood was generally safe, and her parents were not concerned as long as she returned before dark. However, as the day went on, her parents began to grow more and more worried when she did not return home. By the time the evening came around and Candy was still not home, they were in a state of panic. They reported her missing to the police, and soon the entire community was searching for Candy. However, in 1959, with no GPS, cameras, cell phones, or any of the other technology we have today, the searchers had very little to go on. They did, however, find boxes of campfire mints like the ones Candy was selling. These boxes were found on Pettit Drive heading north away from the West Central neighborhood where Candy and her parents lived. In the days that followed, it was estimated that over 1,200 volunteers from in and around Spokane joined in the search for Candy. They scoured the city and the surrounding areas, but their efforts would prove fruitless. Even the U.S. Air Force contributed, providing a helicopter crew that would search the remote areas surrounding Spokane from above. Tragically, the day after Candy's disappearance, this helicopter crashed into the Spokane River after colliding with some high-tension power lines above the area. 3 of the 5 crew members, Airman Marluz D. Ray, Sergeant William May McDonald, and Lieutenant Kenneth J. Fotek, were killed in the crash. The other 2 crew members were injured but survived. Search efforts continued in the 2 weeks after the crash, but the number of volunteers was dwindling, as many had given up hope of finding the young girl. But on March 21, 1959, 2 airmen from Fairchild were out hunting in the woods off the Old Trails Road at a spot about 7 miles from Candy's house. They found a pair of girls' shoes in the woods. They too had obviously heard about Candy being missing, and on their way back, they wondered if these shoes belonged to her. When they reported what they'd found to the authorities, a search party was organized, and the next day, this party descended upon the area where the hunters had found the shoes. Only a few minutes into the search, Candy's body was discovered buried under a shallow layer of brush and pine needles. Though her parents had hoped against all hope that she was perhaps alive, they now knew for sure that she was gone forever, and they were devastated. When Candy's body was found, forensic science was nothing like it is today. Back in 1959, there was no such thing as DNA analysis. When they examined Candy's body, all they were able to tell was that she'd been dead for about 2 weeks and that she'd been cruelly strangled to death with a piece of her own clothing. They were also able to tell she'd been sexually assaulted before her death. Due to this, police officers were careful to preserve any evidence found at the crime scene. They stored samples of Candy's clothing, which they believed contained the DNA of the person who had killed her. Despite the fact that DNA testing or analysis did not yet exist at the time, they stored the evidence in the hopes that someday it would help them solve the case. Other than this, the police did not really have much to work with. They put out a request to the public asking for anyone with any leads or information regarding the murder to come forward. This was the beginning of a long and tiring investigation. Little did they know that it would drag on for more than 60 years. In 1959, there was no registered sex offender program. So instead, the police looked up all individuals in the area with similar criminal histories. They also followed up on thousands of tips provided to them by the public, but very few actually proved useful. However, they did zero in on a number of suspects in the initial stages of the investigation. A prime suspect whom the police never had enough evidence against, but whom they seriously questioned, was Hugh Beyond Morse. Hugh Morse was a serial killer who murdered 2 Spokane women and nearly killed a third in a cross-country spree of violence against women and girls in the late 1950s and 60s. When Candy's body was found, there was a piece of grape chewing gum on it, a flavor Morse was known to like, adding to the suspicions of the police. However, Morse was later ruled out by DNA evidence in 2001. Another suspect the police had at the time was a man named Alfred Graves. Alfred Graves was 50 years old and lived at 815 North Cannon Street. At the time, he'd been involved in allegations that he had attempted some inappropriate contact with several women. Furthermore, police found newspaper clippings about eloped women in the room where Graves had been staying. They also found bobby pins and some sections of rope in the trunk of his car. The investigators at the time were particularly interested in the rope because Candy's body showed marks that seemed to indicate a rope had been tied around her waist. However, there was no rope found with her body. Yet, since Graves killed himself and police could not find any evidence actually linking him to Candy, they could not be sure of his involvement. There was another suspect who also killed himself. This man was James Howard Barnett, age 49, of 2125 West Cinto Avenue. He was taken into police custody in 1960. He hung himself in his cell at the Spokane County Jail on February the 7th, 1964, days after he was arrested on suspicion. In a grisly detail that was released to the public, we learned that Barnett wrote a message on his cell wall in his own blood, which said, "I have sinned against the Lord." However, police never had enough evidence against Barnett to link him to the murder. Eventually, despite the dogged efforts, both in the Spokane Police Department and outside of it, the case went cold. There was a lack of tangible leads for the investigators to follow, but they never gave up on Candy. In fact, as the original detectives grew old and retired from the force, they passed on the case to the younger investigators who had replaced them, and encouraged them to keep digging in the hopes that they would find something that the initial investigators had missed. This became a tradition as one generation of detectives would pass on Candy's case to the next generation. And in this manner, Candy's case was kept alive among the police of Spokane. They worked the case for decades hoping that eventually something would turn up. And finally, it did. In early 2021, the case was being worked on by Sergeant Zach Stormant and retired detective of the Spokane Police Department, SPD, Brian Hammond. They were two investigators in a long line of SPD officers never quite willing to give up on Candy's case. And finally, in 2021, they caught a break. In early 2021, a forensic scientist at the crime lab suggested sending the evidence in Candy's case to a private genome sequencing company in Texas. A sample of semen collected from Candy's clothing was provided to that lab. The lab tech stated that the fact that the specimen was intact after over 60 years was in itself a minor miracle. Most of the evidence collected from the original crime scene had not been stored properly and had been contaminated in the years that had passed. Luckily, this crucial piece of evidence had been kept in an airtight mason jar, preserving it perfectly. The specimen was input into a genealogy database, which narrowed potential matches down to three brothers, John Ray Hoff, Andrew Hoff, and Terry Allen Hoff. John Ray was the only one of the three to have children. Detectives contacted his daughter, Kathy Hoff, and asked if she'd be willing to provide them with a DNA sample that they could test against the evidence from the crime scene all those decades ago. Kathy agreed, and in September 2021, she submitted her DNA to the police. When the results came back, there was no more questioning it. John Ray Hoffman's DNA perfectly matched the DNA left at the crime scene decades earlier. Police had finally found their man. Sadly, however, they could not serve him the justice he deserved as they learned that John had killed himself in 1970. John Hoff joined the Army at 17, and at the time of the murder, he lived in Spokane, only about a mile away from where Candy lived. He'd been 20 years old in 1959 when he committed the horrific act of assaulting and murdering poor Candy. He'd gotten to know Candy through his 10-year-old sister at the time, who was part of the same Campfire Girls troupe. This was not the only time he would do something horrible. In 1961, 2 years after Candy was murdered, Hoff was convicted of assault in the second degree with intent to rob. In that incident, Hoff accosted a female, forcibly removed the victim's clothes, tied her up using her own garment, and strangled her before fleeing the scene. The victim survived, and Hoff spent 6 months in jail for the attack. Based on his conviction, Hoff was declared a deserter from the Army and was discharged. He was employed as a door-to-door salesman and worked at a lumber yard at the time of his expulsion from the military. In 1970, at the age of 31, Hoffman committed suicide. To be 100% sure that Hoffman was indeed their man, police obtained a warrant to exhume his body and collect sample DNA to test against their evidence. When they did so, it came back as a perfect match. There was no doubt. After 60 long years of what seemed to be a never-ending investigation, they had finally found the man who ended poor Candy's life. 60 years is a very long time, and almost all of Candy's relatives had passed away without ever finding out who was responsible for her murder. Both of her parents died wondering who had taken their little girl from them. Candy's cousin Joanne Paz, now herself in her 70s, was available for comment when the news was released. It's not closure, but at least there's some form of satisfaction there, knowing that the person that did it is at least named, Paz said. He may be in a grave, but he's named. While Paz herself was relieved to finally have answers, she knows that something Candy's parents never got. They never saw him pay or die for it or whatever, she said. They went to their grave not knowing, and that was hard. Very hard. Spokane detectives were overjoyed at the end of a case that they'd been working on for over 60 years. Major crimes detective Zach Stormand said the closing of the case had been a long time coming. It's the Mount Everest of our cold cases, the one we could never seem to overcome. But at the same time, nobody ever forgot, he said. Finally, over 6 decades, the case was solved, and we hope that wherever she is, Candy is resting peacefully. And there it is, folks, the tale of how a 60-year-old cold case was finally solved. Are you impressed by the dedication shown by the generations of detectives who never let the memory of Candy fade away? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. As always, stay safe until next time. Like this video and subscribe, please.